Gives me such great pleasure to introduce Ratnaprabha, who's going to give this talk entitled Evolutionary Buddhism. And I'd just like to say, so Ratnaprabha is the final act today. So it'll take us all the way through to 5 o'clock. We'll have a little space at the end, possibly for some questions and answers. But I just wanted to say this a bit. Ratnaprabha was our president here just up until the beginning of this year, when Parliament took over. And he's been president of Brighton since 2008. It's a long old stint, earlier on. And he's had an early fascination with the natural world since he was a child. Trained as a physicist in physics. And he encountered the secret, I believe, at Brighton here in, way back in the day. And since then, they've been lifelong spiritual friends. Probably this century. So Ratnaprabha was ordained in 1982, and his name is the Shining of the Jewel. The Shining of the Jewel. And since his ordination, he's been writing and teaching, particularly in Scandinavia, in Spain, in Singapore, and all over the UK. So he's listed on your on this bio of, he was chair of Cambridge for 6 years, taught at Padmaloka for 7 years, and then attended the West London Buddhist Centre for 10 years as an in-house teacher, and then became chair of the North London Buddhist Centre. He stepped down in 23.
Beginning of this year, yeah.
Beginning of this year, yeah. So also, some of the books you'll come across in the bookshop downstairs are authored by, so he's written extensively, but 2 of his books are Finding the Mind, a Buddhist View, and
the Evolving Mind.
Evolving, yeah. So let's welcome Ratnaprabha for his talk.
Thanks, Madhudarshan. Yeah, so I came down to Brighton in my late teens to study physics at Sussex University. And so Brighton was very important to me. I had a fantastic time when I was down here, even before I encountered Buddhism. But when I was about to do my finals in 1976, February 1976, I was getting more and more stressed about these big exams coming up. I thought I must learn meditation. I must learn meditation. And I saw a little poster, and there was a meditation course going on in the Interfaith Chapel on the Sussex campus, this round building, which I assume is still there. And it was being led by Cassandra. And so I joined the course. And this is, incredibly life transforming for me to have that course. It wasn't just learning meditation, it was meeting Cassandra. Vasantra was even younger than he is now. But even then, he was a fantastic teacher. But also, what I felt from Vasantra was, here is a man who has worked on himself. He was very friendly, he was very helpful, he was very informative. But the kind of person he was, I realized, he wasn't just like that from birth. He'd worked on himself. And that opened a spark of interest in the Dharma, in Buddhism. I thought, this is interesting. And so I started attending the centre, which was then in George Street, where Vasantra lived with Mangala above the centre, or next door to the centre, because they have 2 houses there. And the first thing that I went for, the first thing I decided was, I'm not going to read about Buddhism. And that might surprise you, but the thing was that I had always been an amasser of facts. I'd learnt about science. I'd learnt not just about physics, but about biology, because as you say, I was fascinated by natural history and animals and so on. When I was 11, I started writing a book that would give details and a little drawing of every mammal species existing on the planet. So this is the way my mind works, amassing facts. And I thought, Buddhism is different. I don't want to do it like that. So I didn't read books about Buddhism. But what I couldn't resist, when I saw these cassette tapes in the George Street Centre of Bante's talks, of Sangharakshita's talks on Buddhism, and there was this series, the Path of the Higher Evolution, or whatever it's called. Right, so I took those out and I took them home and I listened to those. And that really captivated me even more, because here was Sangharakshita, not a scientist, but trying to say, well, Buddhism and science in some ways are pursuing the same goals. Buddhism in a way is evolutionary. And so I thought I might give you a talk now just about that fact, I would say, about that, at least that approach to Buddhism, seeing Buddhism as an evolutionary spiritual discipline. In a way, even saying evolution as a vision, as being a Buddhist style vision of the way the universe works. And this culminated in me writing a book called The Evolving Mind, which sort of expanded on Sangharakshita's ideas on evolution and tried to sort of firm them a bit more in hard science and see how this process might have worked. So I thought I'd start with a little story, which is the origin myth of the Tibetan people, which you might have come across before. So according to this story, there are different versions of it, but according to this story, once upon a time, Asia was covered by the sea. Then gradually the Himalayan mountains started to emerge from the sea. And as they emerged from the sea, the first place to emerge was the land of Tibet, the highest land of mountains. There, sitting on one of the mountain peaks, was a rock demoness, an ogress, a female demon living in the rocks. And she looked about and she had no companions. But then, washed up on the beach, as the sea level descended, was a very soggy monkey. So we have two beings here on the pinnacles, on the mountains of Tibet. We have the rock demoness and the monkey. And the rock demoness rushed over to the monkey. She thought, shall I eat him? She thought, no, I'm lonely. I'll get to know him. So they became friends. The rock demoness and the monkey became friends. They became companions. And she thought, I need a husband. I need somebody, a life companion. I need someone to live with. I need someone to bring up a family with. He was reluctant at first because, partly because she was a rock demoness, and partly because he was a disciple of Avalokiteshvara and he thought that being a Buddhist meant that you had to be celibate. So he went to see Avalokiteshvara, and Avalokiteshvara thought, well, I don't know, what does she say? And the monkey said, well, what she says is that if I don't marry her, she will eat everything that lives in Tibet. And Avalokiteshvara said, well, I think in that case, you'd better marry her. So they set up home together. One by one, 6 children were born. 6 children, one for each of the tribes of Tibet. And also one for each of the 6 realms. So, I mean, if you tell the story in full, you then go through what each of the children was like. You know, one was like a hungry ghost and so on, all that kind of thing. Well, I won't go into all that. But, you know, eventually there were more offspring. Eventually there were actually 400. There were now 400 beings living in Tibet in the forest. And they were living on the fruit and nuts of the forest. The fruit and nuts of the forest, as happens with overpopulation, ran out. And some of the children cried. Some of the children fought each other. And so the monkey separated them into the tribes of Tibet. And he suggested, why don't you try agriculture? I said, what's that? Why don't you try agriculture? So he was given by Avalokiteshvara 5 grains. And I can't remember what they all are, but like barley, wheat, rye, that kind of thing. And they went off and planted them. They They lost their fur gradually. Their tails shrank. They acquired language. They became erect. They developed all sorts of customs. And eventually, they developed a concern for the welfare of others. And it's said that Tibetans today combine the traits of these ancestors. So some of them are rather pious, like the monkey, rather curious. Some of them are filled with drive and energy, like the rock demoness, and so on. So this is the origin myth of Tibet, which you'll find in medieval Tibetan sources, by the way. This is not in any way influenced by Charles Darwin, even though it sounds just like the origin of species in some ways. But it is actually typical of Buddhist origin myths. They describe a gradual development down generations. In other words, they're evolutionary myths. So if you want to explore this further, for example, read the Aganya Sutta in the Hinayana or the Theravada scriptures. So there's no divine creation in these myths. They are evolutionary. And this, it seems to me, is because Buddhism itself is intrinsically evolutionary. That is, its whole worldview, and maybe unlike any other religion or major spiritual system, has an evolutionary vision to it. And this is what makes it different. And this is what also makes it, in my view, compatible with science. It has the same basic vision that science does, at least of life. And this evolutionary vision, well, it's something that always really drawn me ever since I was a child. And I can remember as a teenager trying to work out what happens next. Here we are, human beings. What happens next? We've evolved, I was fascinated by all this. We've evolved from primate ancestors. We've evolved through all these different kinds of early hominids and all that kind of thing. What happens next? So that really fascinated me. And there, in those taped lectures by Sangharakshita, was at least an answer to that. However, there is a downside to all this. There's a misuse of all this, as you probably know. And I think this may be why the whole idea of Buddhism as a higher evolution, in a way, has not really stuck in Triratna in general. I did write a Mitra study module for year 4 on evolutionary Buddhism. If anyone is leading Mitra study or doing Mitra study, it's a very good module. It's very interesting stuff. Not just for, I say write it, I compiled a lot of it, comes from other sources. But it's not really popular. It's an optional one. And I think most people, do correct me if I'm wrong, but most people don't do it. People twitch when they hear that idea of applying an evolutionary idea to human beings because they think of a hierarchy of races, perhaps, racist ideas, or of eugenics, of trying to breed people to be better. In other words, to be more like the person that directs the breeding program. But also there's the fact that the basic so-called lower evolutionary process, well, is there anything really spiritual about it? In a way, from a Buddhist point of view, it's driven by craving. It's driven by the drive for the species to perpetuate itself, and even for the genes. The Richard Dawkins' idea of the selfish gene. The gene is a little machine that's taking you over and trying to make you make more and more of its own genes. It's driven by survival. While you could say that Buddhism is not about survival, it is about extinction. And the word nirvana, in a way, means extinction or cessation. But what that means, of course, is the extinction of samsara. So you could say the higher evolution is the opposite of the lower evolution, which in a way is fair enough. So what is evolution, though? What is evolution? And here we come into a little bit of a problem, especially since Dawkins. I think The Selfish Gene was published in the late 70s, about the time I started coming along, about 1979, I think. And in a way, it's rather co-opted the idea of evolution into being a purely biological thing. But actually, the word evolution is used in other contexts. So you'll hear people talking about the evolution of the jet engine or something like that. And really, evolution means any continuous process that you can trace from stage to stage, which is governed by certain laws, which is why it's scientific. And those laws can be discovered. And at least apparently, it has a direction to it. And this is where Dawkins would say, oh, no, there's no direction. But at least apparently there is a direction, as I'll say more about it later on. And so this idea goes back a long way. I mean, it goes back to the ancient Greeks, goes back into the ancient Chinese. There's evolutionary visions there in a lot of different traditions. That's a big topic. I won't go into it all. But eventually, of course, it leads to Charles Darwin. It leads to Darwinian evolution, where Darwin gave it a proper scientific theoretical basis in his theory of the natural selection. So what you need for this kind of thing is these laws of development, which combine with a source of either originality or randomness. So in other words, the laws of development don't always just follow exactly the same path. Things change, and change has to come in from somewhere, either from something creative or from just random variations. And people used to think that the main driving force with evolution was just sometimes the genes randomly change. So, you know, your cat, you've got two black cats, but then a tabby cat emerges because of random mutations. Maybe the tabby cat is better adapted for being camouflaged in the jungle. So those tabby cats get more and more frequent in the population. And so the descendants differ in unpredictable ways from their ancestors, and the more fit, as they say, descendants survive. So that's the way biological evolution works. But the word evolution itself just literally means unrolling. And the first way it was used in the as it were, modern Europe was the development of the fetus in the womb. They call that the evolution. And if you look at the different stages of the fetus in the womb, it is a little bit like an unrolling, like the fiddlehead of a fern gradually opening as the fetus from its curled up position grows into more like human form and then finally is born. So this unrolling, but it's unrolling. When I thought of unrolling, I thought it's like a carpet. But if you unroll the carpet, of course, the pattern is already there. But in evolution, the pattern changes as it unrolls. So it's more like the unrolling of a dream. And the thing about evolution is that it's about living creatures going beyond themselves. That seems to me, I talked about the evolutionary vision. It is a vision. It's something which you'll find in a lot of biologists, but also others as well. People like Ken Wilber, for example, other people who are interested in the cosmos, the way things work, the way things hang together. And they'll talk about evolution in this visionary way as creatures going beyond themselves, creatures changing from generation to generation, but not just changing and shuffling around and reshuffling, but actually developing new abilities, new senses, new mental abilities, and so on. So Darwinism was very, very successful and still is very, very successful, although it has had to be modified. And it shows the origin of species. But when we look at life, probably most of us at least, we're not just interested in saying, how did the birds emerge from the dinosaurs or something like that? We also, what's it all mean? What's really going on? And this is, again, where the vision comes in. And for me, I think even before I came across Buddhism, and definitely there in the idea of evolution, I felt the thing that gives meaning to life is the thread of consciousness, the thread of consciousness. And that's what we find when we look into life. And what I'd call this is, at the growing tip of evolution, there's a constantly developing increased scope of awareness. And that's also what you're doing in Buddhism. You're constantly developing an increasing scope of awareness. So you could call this a direction. Is it a direction? That's a question you can ask. Does it mean it has a goal? Is it trying to get somewhere? That's another question you can ask, which they call a telos, is the Greek for a goal. So they call it teleological, which again is a buzzword that you've got to warn against if you're a biologist. Don't let it be teleological. In fact, it is interesting that Darwin, in his own notes, he said, never talk about lower and higher. So according to that, he wouldn't have liked the idea of a lower evolution and a higher evolution. However, read Darwin's books, he's always talking about lower and higher, actually. And he couldn't resist that, in a way, because it's so obvious. So there's this sort of mind-expanding tendency, a self-reinforced mind-expanding tendency, which you can determine. It doesn't happen in all lineages. That's what I mean by it being the growing point. So there was a time when there was no mind at all on the planet, if we look at it just in purely sort of archaeological terms. Then there was a time when you had primitive animals. Those animals were able to respond. So there would be a stimulus, and they would respond appropriately. If the stimulus was a food chemical gradient that said, oh, there's something to eat over here, they'd move towards it. If the stimulus was something nasty coming, they'd move away from it. So that's what mind simply means. Whatever happens inside the organism between the stimulus and the response. So there are minds happening very early on. Between sensation and action, I've got down here as well. So this means that we don't just have an evolution of form, like the dinosaurs of developing into birds, but we also have an evolution of mind. Once mind emerges, you will tend to get more and more animals being evolved that have better and better minds. Some lineages will never get any better, but some of them will. They'll develop new senses, they'll develop much better processing capability, and also they'll develop much more complex behavior. Some of the things I'm saying here are just little hints. If you want to read The Evolving Mind, you'll see some more in there, or the Mitch Study course. Because behavior, the way that animals behave, what does that produce? Well, when it's shared, when it's taught to other animals, it becomes what we call culture. So culture has a technical definition, is used within biology as well, to mean the patterns of behavior that animals are able to develop and often are able to teach their own offspring or even learn from each other. So in a way, you can see three strands of evolution. You can see the evolution of biological form, the evolution of the mind, and also the evolution of culture, of different cultures emerging. In the mind, you can see different forms of consciousness. You can see simple consciousness, it's just responsive. Then you can see, there are lots of stages, but you can also see something called centered consciousness, which is where there's a sort of a feeling, a rather dim and shadowy feeling that there's a me in the middle and there's things happening to me. So if you imagine a squirrel leaping from oak tree to oak tree, it has this ambience around it of the world that it's moving through. And so it has a much more sophisticated consciousness than you're just a little worm in the ground or something like that. And then we have, in a way, the pinnacle of the lower evolution is when self-reflexive consciousness emerges, when your awareness is strong enough that you can realize that you exist. You can look back at your own mind. And this is, from a Buddhist point of view, at least, this is an incredibly significant moment. So these levels of consciousness are there. Now, one thing that I haven't got time to go into, but I found really interesting was, how do these different strands of evolution influence each other? How do behavior, mind, and form influence each other? And this is where lower evolution isn't just a sort of a nice parallel. You could call biological evolution an evolution. You could also call spiritual life an evolution. Actually, there may be some genuine similarities between them, in that mind is involved in both. And what I would suggest is that once you have mind, the mind will influence behavior, the behavior influences the selection of ecological niches. So an animal can actually decide to live a slightly different life. So in other words, a sort of a creative element comes in to the animal. And my favorite example is during this period of the dinosaurs, already mammals, but they were little night-dwelling shrew-like creatures that ran amongst the leaf litter and tried to avoid being trodden on by huge dinosaurs. But one day, to turn this into a mythical story, one day, one particularly intelligent little shrew started to get light. It looked up into a tree. There was a juicy beetle up the tree, because these were insect-eating creatures. It runs up the tree and grabs the beetle and thinks, what am I doing up here? Help! It runs back down into leaf litter again, very scared. But the next day, there were beetles up there. I'm going to give it a go again. And after a while, it's through behavior evolution, through cultural evolution, this behavior has spread. More and more of them are living up trees. Because they're living up trees, the selection pressures on them completely change. And now they grow bigger eyes, they become diurnal instead of nocturnal, they become fruit-eating instead of insect-eating, and instead of insectivores, we have the primates, our own ancestors. So I couldn't resist dropping that in. But what I'm saying there is that mind, and there, by the way, this is not my idea, it's called the Baldwin effect, and there is evidence, actual fossil evidence for this kind of thing. So it does seem that mental processes, a decision to try a new behavior, will actually influence the direction of evolution. And it could even be the main influence on the main changes, the main divergences in animal evolution, at least in higher animals. So there's sort of a feedback loop there as well, because the more the mind tries new things, the more the selection pressure to have a better mind. And so consciousness will tend to expand generation by generation until eventually we reach self-reflexive consciousness. And when we reach that point, that is pivotal, because we could say that is what mindfulness means. Mindfulness means being aware and being aware of being aware. But however, it has its downsides because it creates a defensive self. In a way, you could argue that the squirrel running through the trees does not have an ego. We do. Why do we have an ego? It's because by looking around at ourselves, we suddenly go, oh my goodness, what am I doing here? Help, help, I need to sort of worry. I need to start worrying. Anxiety, let's invent anxiety. And so the defensive self comes in. And the deluded self-view mind, in a sense, is adaptive. Because, if you're a primitive self-aware, let's say, person, it's actually in a way adaptive to be defensive, to be greedy, to do all these different things. There are reasons why these things emerge. Nevertheless, it seems to me Buddhism is evolutionary in its vision, consciously building on the self-awareness that lower evolution arrives at. And that's why Bhante calls Buddhism a higher evolution. And it fits the definition of evolution I've given, but here it proceeds on the individual by individual choice, rather than in the species as a whole. It's not a mass change, like most linear evolution, except in the case of very inventive shrews, where the evolution may happen almost on an individual level through creative. You've probably heard of examples of like individual blue tits discover that they can peck holes in milk bottle tops to drink the cream, and then it spreads through the whole population. But somebody must have started it. Anyway, so I could say loads more about this, as you can imagine, but I thought maybe I'll leave it there just to say that higher evolution is individual and willed until you reach what you might call non-duality. And when you reach that point, when the evolution of consciousness reaches that point, then we can drop that sense of me trying to do this as an isolated individual. And you can get back into the development of Sangha, of connections in Sangha, of interconnectedness, and even of the creation of the Pure Land. Anyway, I will finish with a little lesson from this, a practical lesson, I hope, to how you live a spiritual life. So if you're inspired by something like this evolutionary vision, you could say, what you're trying to do is to create conditions in your life which give you space to transcend. Then choose transcendence. That's all you have to do. Create conditions in your life that give you the space to be creative, to try new things, to take risks. When you have that space, don't forget to actually do it. So I think I'll leave it there, if that's all right.
Thank you. Can I put some questions?
It's 4:51, if that's correct.
Yeah. So I'm just here to allow some space to, if anybody wants to.
I just wanted to say something, by the way, which was that being the 50th anniversary, the very special occasion, the temptation, of course, is just to reminisce. And I hope there's been a lot of reminiscing already this weekend. I'm really pleased to hear that the chairs came along, that Vasantara was here, that Mangala is here as well. Vasantara was the chair when I started coming, and then Vasantara moved up to Aratara and Mangala became the chair. Those are the two people who were formative for me in 1976 and 1977 when I was down in Brighton. So I'm really hope that you had lots and lots of reminiscence and you don't mind the fact that I kept that to a little bit of a minimum. But I do have lots of very, very fond and happy memories of the Brighton Buddhist Centre when it was in George Street, and then when it moved to Park Crescent, and then, of course, when it moved here. Oh, yes.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting. Something that stuck with me was your mentioning of consciousness as a thread. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, I suppose not everybody has to be sort of philosophical, but sometimes you feel, I want to find meaning in life. What's it all about? What is good? What's worth putting my energy into? And the way I would put it, for this works for me, I'm not saying this is for everybody, is if I can expand the scope of my awareness, that is fantastic. The more I can do that, expanding the scope of my awareness through meditation, but also through getting to know people as well. Through developing wisdom, if I can, all that kind of thing, is in itself a good. You don't have to convince people. Well, you probably do actually, but I don't need convincing about that. Expanding the scope of awareness is a really good thing. In other words, taking consciousness, human consciousness, that is what it means to be oneself, into new areas, new unknown spaces. So I think the thread of consciousness, it gives meaning for one's own life, but it also gives meaning for the whole evolutionary process. Why does evolution matter? Because it has produced aware human beings. Why do human beings matter? Because they produced Buddhas. That's what is really important, it seems to me. That's what I would say.
I've always found it quite interesting that there seems to be a bit of, like you mentioned, an inherent tension between our biological drives, maybe our spiritual drives. And one example that comes to mind is, think of yogis or practitioners who would go off into caves and they'd stay there for years just meditating. And I always wondered, how did that fit with our need for socializing, or I need to be intimately connected with other people? But then at the same time, I've had experiences through meditation, or where I haven't been with other people, where I've had a mental sense of being interconnected, even though there's no one physically around. So,
yeah. Well, in a way, I think you've answered your own question, because that solitude and meditation can be a really good way of developing connections. But my understanding is that, say, in some religions, you will have hermits who basically wall themselves up and don't have any communication, and that's it. And because you have the value of a relationship with God, you can say, it's okay, I'm doing what I should. But my understanding is in Buddhism, people do not do that. So Milarepa, for example, did wall himself up in caves for years and years and years, But then he spent the last years of his life in intensive interaction with other people. Now he was encouraging them, you go to caves as well. But of all the people in the history of Tibet, he's possibly been the one person who's had the most influence on the greatest number of lives. I know Vasanta just finished doing a retreat at Adhisthana on Milarepa, haven't you? And I don't know if you'd agree with me, but it seems to me that Milarepa, despite being a hermit, has had a huge influence. And he had many, many friends, many close associates. So, but it's a good point. And I think that it's sometimes said that, one thing that, I don't know if this is true, but I've heard that a bodhisattva, the bodhisattva precepts say that you must not take a lifelong vow of silence. In other words, you must be open to communication. But that doesn't mean don't go on a 1 week or a 3 week silent retreat, by all means, but don't go on a 100-year silent retreat. Actually, yeah.
So interesting. Ages ago, that stuck with me. He said, I go on retreats in order to come back.
Yeah.
And I like that. It's hard to go away, but when you go away to come back.
So Milarepa went into his cave in order to come out of his cave. Yeah.
Okay, it's a bit of speculation, but thinking about what you've said about the evolution of consciousness, presumably that's why Buddhism can be literally a cosmic religion. I'm going to be a bit sci-fi here, sorry. That if you have evolution happening in other worlds and consciousness has actually got survival value, then you get other conscious beings who start reflecting and they start suffering, and they reflect on the suffering. So I can imagine, again, sorry, I went carried away.
Yeah.
I can imagine sort of Buddhist celestials, sorry, because throughout the universe there are conscious beings and they all suffer.
Yeah.
And some of them must go, suffering, how do I get rid of this?
I don't think you need to apologize. I think there's a lot of truth in that. It must be. And in a way, it's an incredibly positive, optimistic view, isn't it? So you don't have to worry that aliens are all going to be vicious sadists whose only aim is to come and kill us all and gobble us up or something. No, aliens, there will be some negativity amongst them because the process of developing consciousness probably needs to go through that self-conscious bottleneck where the ego and its needs arise. And then you realize that that ego and its needs are generating suffering, not just the ordinary suffering of sometimes being hungry or bird hurting your foot or being eaten by a Tyrannosaurus Rex, but the suffering of existential angst and all that kind of thing. And as you say, that then you'll want to find a way through that. And you'll go further than the self-aware level, and you'll go up towards the Buddha level. So there should be Buddhas, it may take a long time, but sooner or later, Buddhas should be emerging in any conscious civilization. So that's where they are. Some of them are green in the northern direction. Some of them in the eastern direction are blue. Some of them going to the south are yellow. And then we have the red ones in Sakavati in the Pure Land in the west, but they're all just aliens.
Possibly praising what Ratnaprabha has just shared with us in his incredibly elegant talk. But a couple of things did pop out for me, which will stay with me. I mean, it took us from Tibetan mythology through to oneself. And that was a kind of a tour de force through the evolutionary process. But the thing that left in my mind really was when we were a child saying what happens next. And that really, I really resonated with that. And I still resonate with that. What happens next in lots of different ways. So I'd just like to thank you once again for coming down, being with us down 50.